The summer of 1946 hit the Midwest like a blast furnace door swinging open, and Harold Dietrich watched the thermometer outside his dairy barn climb past 105 degrees by 10 in the morning. Inside the barn, his 12 Holsteins were already showing signs of heat stress, their breathing shallow and rapid, milk production dropping by the hour. Every farmer in Jefferson County knew what extreme heat meant for dairy cattle. The animals could stop eating entirely, their body temperatures could spike dangerously high, and a productive milk cow could become a veterinary emergency in less than a day. Harold had survived the Dust Bowl years, brought his small operation through wartime rationing, and now this relentless heat wave threatened everything he had rebuilt. His neighbor's herd had already lost 2 animals to heat exhaustion that week, and the weatherman on the radio kept saying the hot spell would last at least another 10 days. Standing in that sweltering barn with sweat soaking through his shirt before noon, Harold knew he had to find a way to cool the space, or watch his livelihood collapse around him. The problem with barn cooling in the 1940s was that most farmers had neither the electricity for mechanical fans nor the money for expensive ventilation systems. Rural electrification had reached some areas, but many farms still operated on limited power, and the cost of running electric fans continuously during a heat wave was prohibitive, even for those who had access. Harold's barn had been built in 1923, following traditional design principles with high ceilings and cupolas for natural ventilation. But when outside temperatures topped 100 degrees and the humidity stayed high, passive airflow could not prevent dangerous heat buildup. The cattle clustered near the few windows, their tongues hanging out, and Harold could see the stress in their eyes. He had read about commercial refrigeration systems being developed for large dairy operations out east, but those installations cost thousands of dollars and required engineering expertise far beyond what a small family farm could manage. What Harold needed was something he could build himself with materials he could afford, and he needed it working by tomorrow morning. That evening, Harold drove his truck into town for the weekly farmers' gathering at Schneider's Feed and Supply, where local agricultural men met to discuss crops, equipment, and shared problems. The conversation inevitably turned to the heat wave, with several farmers expressing worry about livestock survival if temperatures did not break soon. Old Emil Kruger, who had been farming since before the First World War, sat quietly listening until someone mentioned trying to rig up some kind of cooling system. Then Emil leaned forward and described something he had seen work during the brutal summer of 1936, back when the Dust Bowl heat had combined with economic depression to create desperate conditions across rural America. Emil explained that a farmer over in the next county had soaked heavy canvas tarps in water and hung them across the barn's windward openings, positioning them so the prevailing breeze had to pass through the wet fabric before entering the barn. The evaporating water had pulled heat from the air, dropping the barn's interior temperature by as much as 15 to 20 degrees on hot, dry days. The principle was ancient, Emil said, the same reason water in a canvas canteen stayed cool even in summer sun. But applying it on a barn scale required understanding how air moved and how much water you needed to keep the cloth saturated. Harold listened intently as Emil sketched the basic concept on the back of a feed invoice. The system worked best, Emil explained, when you had good cross-ventilation with air entering through the wetted cloth and exhausting through openings on the opposite side of the barn. The cloth had to be heavy enough to hold significant water, but porous enough to let air pass through, and it needed to stay wet because once the fabric dried out, the cooling effect stopped immediately. You also had to consider humidity levels because evaporative cooling worked most effectively in dry air. When humid air passed through wet cloth, the cooling effect was much less dramatic. Emil remembered that the farmer he had learned this from used old wool blankets along with canvas, claiming the wool held water better and released it more slowly than cotton alone. The farmer had rigged up a simple water distribution system using galvanized guttering positioned above the hanging cloth, with small holes drilled along the gutter's length to create a continuous drip that kept the fabric saturated. Gravity fed the system from a water tank elevated on a platform, and the whole apparatus could be assembled from materials most farmers already had around their property. Harold drove home that night, with his mind racing through the logistics of building a cloth cooling system before the next day's heat arrived. He had several old canvas tarps in the machine shed left over from covering hay wagons, plus some wool horse blankets that had been his father's and were still in decent condition despite decades of use. The barn's main doors faced west, which meant the prevailing afternoon breeze would naturally flow through any cloth he hung there, and he had enough scrap lumber to build frames to support the hanging fabric. The trickiest part would be the water distribution system, because he needed steady saturation without wasting water, which was already running low in his well during the drought conditions. Harold spent an hour that night in the barn with a kerosene lantern, measuring the door openings and planning how to position the frames so they would not block necessary access while maximizing the cooling effect. He decided to focus on the two largest openings first, the main west door, where the afternoon sun beat directly into the barn, and the loading door on the north side, which could serve as the exhaust point for the cross breeze. By dawn the next morning, Harold was already in the machine shed, pulling out canvas and searching for suitable support materials. He found two sections of old well pipe that could serve as horizontal crossbars, several lengths of chain for hanging the cloth, and enough 2x4 lumber to construct simple frames. His son Robert, who was 14 and strong enough for serious farm work, helped carry materials to the barn, while Harold's wife Marie started preparing the cloth by cutting it to size and sewing reinforced edges with grommets for the hanging chains. The work required precision because if the cloth hung too loosely, it would billow in the wind and dry out too quickly. But if it was stretched too tightly, the water would run off too fast without saturating the fabric properly. Marie had learned practical sewing skills during the Depression when every piece of fabric had to serve multiple purposes, and she understood instinctively how the cloth needed to behave. She doubled the top edges and added extra grommets every 12 inches to distribute the weight evenly once the fabric was soaked with water. By mid-morning, with the temperature already climbing past 90 degrees, Harold and Robert had the first frame installed across the main west door. They hung 3 layers of cloth, canvas on the outside to catch the initial water distribution, wool blanket in the middle to hold moisture, and a lighter cotton sheeting on the inside to provide a final cooling stage as air passed through toward the barn's interior. Harold had rigged up his water system using an old water tank positioned on a platform built from stacked hay bales, giving him about 8 feet of elevation for gravity feed. He ran a length of rubber hose from the tank to a section of guttering he had positioned above the hanging cloth, and he had carefully drilled holes along the gutter's underside at 2-inch intervals. When he opened the valve on the hose, water flowed into the gutter and began dripping through the holes onto the cloth below, spreading across the fabric in dark, wet streaks that gradually expanded until the entire curtain was saturated. The effect was not immediate, but as the morning sun climbed higher and the temperature pushed toward 100 degrees again, Harold began to notice a definite difference. Air passing through the wet cloth felt noticeably cooler, maybe 10 or 15 degrees lower than the outside temperature, and more importantly, it felt fresher somehow, less oppressively hot. The cattle noticed too, several of them moving closer to the west door where the cooled air was entering, their breathing becoming less labored as the barn's overall temperature started to drop. Harold monitored his water usage carefully, adjusting the valve to provide just enough flow to keep the cloth wet without wasting water that ran off unused. He found that the wool blanket in the middle layer absorbed water like a sponge and released it slowly, while the outer canvas caught the dripping water and prevented too much from escaping before the evaporation process could extract the heat. By early afternoon, Harold had the second cooling screen installed at the north loading door, creating a genuine cross-breeze system that pulled the hot air out of the barn while drawing cooled air in through the west opening. The temperature inside the barn dropped to around 85 degrees, even though outside temperatures had reached 107, and the cattle were behaving almost normally again, eating hay and drinking water instead of just standing listlessly in the heat. Robert had been skeptical when they started the project that morning, questioning whether wet cloth could really make a difference against such extreme heat. But now he stood at the barn entrance, feeling the cooled air flow past him and experiencing firsthand the power of evaporative cooling. Harold explained to his son that the principle worked because water molecules needed energy to change from liquid to gas, and they stole that energy from the surrounding air in the form of heat. The hotter and drier the air, the faster the evaporation happened and the more heat was removed, which was why the system worked best during heat waves when humidity was low. But the real challenge arrived on day 3 of the heat wave, when Harold's well water level dropped low enough that his pump began pulling up sediment and mud. He had been refilling the water tank 3 times daily, and the constant demand was draining his shallow well faster than it could recharge. Harold stood at the wellhead that morning staring at the murky water coming up, knowing that if his well went dry, he would have to haul water from town at 50 cents per barrel, and that cost would eat up any economic benefit the cooling system provided. He needed to make his water supply last longer somehow, which meant either reducing his usage or finding a more efficient way to distribute it. That afternoon, while the cattle drowsed in the cooled barn, Harold experimented with his drip system, plugging some of the holes in his guttering and repositioning others to create targeted saturation only where it mattered most. He discovered that the edges of the cloth did not need as much water as the center because less air passed through those areas, and that slight adjustments to hole size could dramatically affect flow rates. The same day, Harold's neighbor Frank Mueller stopped by to examine the cooling system he had heard about at the feed store. Frank raised hogs, and his animals were suffering even worse than Harold's cattle because pigs cannot sweat and have almost no natural cooling ability beyond seeking shade and wallowing in mud. Frank's mud wallow had dried up in the drought, and he had lost 3 young pigs to heat stress already that week. Harold walked Frank through his setup, explaining the 3-layer cloth system and the water distribution challenges he was working through. Frank was particularly interested in whether the technique would work for a hog barn with its different ventilation setup, and whether the pigs might damage the hanging cloth if they could reach it. The 2 men spent an hour discussing modifications that might work for swine operations, including positioning the cloth higher and using reinforced materials that pigs could not tear easily. Frank left with detailed notes and a piece of canvas to experiment with, and Harold felt the satisfaction that came from sharing knowledge that might save another farmer's animals. Word spread rapidly through Jefferson County over the next few days as temperatures continued to climb, and more farmers faced livestock emergencies. Harold found himself hosting a steady stream of visitors who wanted to see the cloth cooling system in operation and learn how to build their own versions. Some were skeptical, unable to believe that simple wet fabric could make meaningful difference against such extreme heat, and Harold would lead them into the barn to feel the temperature difference themselves. The contrast was always dramatic. Stepping from the furnace heat outside into the cooled barn felt like entering a different climate zone, and the healthy behavior of Harold's cattle, compared to stressed animals in conventional barns, provided undeniable proof that the system worked. Each visitor brought their own variations and improvements to the conversation. Farmers had been solving problems with limited resources for generations, and they understood instinctively how to adapt a basic technique to their specific situations. Emil Kruger visited during the 2nd week of the heat wave, bringing with him a jar of coarse salt and an old recipe for enhancing evaporative cooling that he had learned from his own father decades earlier. Emil explained that adding a small amount of salt to the water could increase the evaporation rate, particularly useful when humidity climbed and regular evaporation slowed down. The salt changed the surface tension of the water and how it interacted with the cloth fibers. Though Emil could not explain the exact chemistry involved, he just knew it worked because he had seen it demonstrated during the terrible heat of 1936. Harold tried the technique that afternoon, dissolving 2 handfuls of salt in his water tank and monitoring the results. The cloth seemed to cool the passing air more effectively even as afternoon humidity rose, and the fabric dried out more slowly overnight when temperatures dropped, which meant he needed less water to resaturate the system each morning. The economic mathematics of cloth cooling became a frequent topic of discussion among farmers who gathered at Schneider's Feed and Supply each evening. Harold had calculated that his entire system, including all cloth, framing materials, guttering, and hardware, had cost him less than $20 in actual cash expenditure, since he had repurposed many existing materials from around his farm. He estimated his water usage at roughly 30 gallons per day to keep the system operating continuously, which during the drought meant hauling supplemental water occasionally, but nothing like the cost of losing even one dairy cow to heat stress. A productive Holstein represented several $100s in capital plus years of future milk production, and Harold's 12 cows were producing nearly normal quantities of milk, despite the extreme heat, while his neighbors without cooling systems saw production drops of 30 to 50%. The numbers made sense, even for farmers operating on Depression-era margins, where every dollar had to justify itself through immediate returns. But the cooling system demanded constant attention that Harold had not fully anticipated during those first desperate days of construction. The cloth had to stay wet, or the cooling effect vanished within minutes, which meant checking the water supply multiple times daily and adjusting the drip rate as weather conditions changed. Debris accumulated in the guttering and had to be cleared regularly or water flow became uneven, leaving dry patches on the cloth that passed hot air directly into the barn. The frames needed periodic tightening as wet fabric stretched and sagged under its own weight, and Harold learned to recognize the subtle signs that indicated something was wrong before the system failed completely. Wind direction changes required adjusting his ventilation openings to maintain proper crossflow, and on rare humid days when evaporative cooling became less effective, he had to compensate by increasing water flow and accepting higher usage rates. Marie took over much of the daily monitoring during the third week, when Harold needed to get into the hayfields for first cutting, despite the ongoing heat. She developed an efficient routine of morning and afternoon checks, becoming adept at spotting problems with water distribution or cloth condition before they became critical. Their daughter Ruth, who was 12 and responsible for helping with household chores, learned to prepare replacement cloth sections when the originals became torn or overly stained with mineral deposits from the well water. The cooling system had become a family operation, essential infrastructure that required attention from everyone, just like feeding livestock or maintaining equipment. Robert surprised his father by suggesting they build a permanent frame structure that could be quickly deployed each summer rather than constructing temporary setups from scratch, an idea that showed the boy was thinking like a farmer about long-term efficiency and resource management. The heat wave finally broke after 17 consecutive days above 100 degrees, a record for Jefferson County that people would reference for decades afterward. Harold's 12 cattle had survived with minimal stress and maintained milk production well enough that he actually showed a profit for those difficult weeks, unlike several neighbors who lost animals or saw their dairy income drop to nearly nothing. The cloth cooling system had proven itself under the most extreme conditions imaginable, and Harold knew the knowledge of how to build and operate such systems would spread throughout the agricultural community as farmers shared stories of what had worked and what had failed during the crisis. This was how rural America had always functioned. Collective wisdom accumulated through individual experimentation and then disseminated freely through the network of personal relationships that connected farming communities across county and state lines. By harvest time that fall, cloth cooling systems had appeared on at least 30 farms in Jefferson County alone, with countless more throughout the Midwest, as the technique spread through conversations at grain elevators, livestock auctions, and farm bureaus. The Agricultural Extension Service sent representatives to interview farmers about their cooling methods, documenting designs and performance data for publication in extension bulletins that would reach farmers who had not heard about the technique through personal networks. Harold spent an afternoon with the extension agent, explaining his 3-layer cloth system and water distribution setup, while the agent took detailed measurements and photographs. The agent was particularly interested in the economic analysis, noting that during an era when farm mechanization required increasing capital investment, here was a valuable technology that worked in the opposite direction by using simple materials and human ingenuity rather than purchased equipment and electricity. Harold continued refining his system through subsequent summers, replacing the temporary hay bale platform with a permanent wooden tower that held his water tank 10 feet above the barn, providing better pressure for his distribution system. He experimented with different cloth combinations, eventually settling on a design that used military surplus canvas from War Department sales, combined with wool army blankets that were being liquidated cheaply as the armed forces downsized after the war. The military-grade materials proved more durable than civilian fabrics, withstanding repeated wetting and drying cycles without deteriorating as quickly. Harold also developed a better understanding of when cooling was necessary and when it was wasteful, learning to read subtle weather signs that indicated whether a hot day would be dry enough for effective evaporative cooling or humid enough that the system would consume more water than the temperature reduction justified. The practice of cloth swamp cooling became particularly important for dairy farmers because milk cows are extremely sensitive to heat stress, and production losses can occur quickly when temperatures spike. Frank Mueller, who had adapted Harold's technique for his hog operation, reported that his cooling system had saved his entire breeding stock during the heat wave, and that his sows had successfully farrowed during hot weather that normally would have caused pregnancy failures. Other farmers found applications for the cooling principle beyond livestock barns, using wet cloth screens on equipment sheds to protect stored grain from heat damage, on chicken coops to prevent layers from going off feed during summer heat, and even on their own homes, where a wet sheet hung in a window could make sleeping possible during the hottest nights. The technique was endlessly adaptable because the underlying physics worked anywhere you had moving air, porous fabric, and water supply. Robert Dietrich grew up with cloth cooling as a normal part of farm management, learning from his father how to build frames, select appropriate materials, calculate water needs, and maintain systems through seasons of varying weather. When Robert eventually took over the dairy operation in 1963, he continued using evaporative cooling techniques even as electric ventilation fans became more affordable and common. Robert discovered that combining the two technologies produced the best results during extreme heat, with electric fans moving air through wet cloth screens more effectively than natural breeze alone, achieving temperature reductions that neither system could accomplish independently. He taught his own children the principles his father had taught him, explaining that farming wisdom was not just about knowing what to do, but understanding why it worked and how to adapt techniques to changing conditions. The knowledge passed down through farming families contained layers of practical understanding that went far beyond simple instructions for building equipment. It included the ability to read weather patterns and anticipate heat stress before it became critical, the skill to diagnose problems with cooling systems by observing cattle behavior rather than just checking thermometers, and the judgment to balance water conservation against cooling needs during drought conditions when every gallon mattered. This accumulated wisdom represented generations of observation and experimentation compressed into practiced routines that successful farmers executed almost instinctively. A visiting agricultural economist from the State University once told Harold that the informal knowledge network connecting rural communities represented an invisible infrastructure as valuable as roads or power lines, and Harold had understood exactly what the man meant because he had experienced countless times how a conversation at the feed store or a neighbor's visit could provide the exact solution needed for a pressing problem. By the early 1970s, mechanical climate control systems had become standard equipment on large commercial farms, where economies of scale justified the capital investment and energy costs. Modern dairy operations housed hundreds or thousands of animals in climate-controlled facilities that maintained optimal temperatures year-round, eliminating heat stress as a production variable. But smaller family farms continued to rely on simpler technologies, including cloth swamp coolers, because the economics still favored low-capital approaches that used readily available materials and minimal energy. The principle remained valid regardless of farm size. Evaporating water removed heat from air, and a well-designed cloth cooling system could protect livestock during heat waves for a fraction of what mechanical refrigeration would cost. Harold retired from active farming in 1974, turning the operation over to Robert, while remaining involved enough to help during busy seasons and offer advice when asked. He kept his original cloth cooling frames stored in the machine shed, the canvas and wool showing decades of use, but still functional when needed. Sometimes on hot summer days, Harold would walk to the barn and find Robert's updated version of the cooling system running, electric fans pushing air through wet cloth, just as Harold had once relied on natural breeze, and he felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that the technique he had learned from Emil Kruger in 1946, was still protecting animals and supporting the family farm 3 decades later. The continuity represented something important about rural American life, each generation building on knowledge inherited from the previous generation while adapting to changing circumstances and new technologies. The cloth swamp coolers that appeared on Midwest farms during the heatwave years represented more than just a cooling technique. They embodied the problem-solving capability and mutual support that defined agricultural communities during an era when farmers routinely faced challenges that threatened their survival and had to create solutions from available resources rather than purchasing them from commercial suppliers. The sharing of knowledge at gatherings like Schneider's Feed and Supply, the willingness of successful farmers like Harold to demonstrate their systems and explain their techniques to neighbors and visitors, and the rapid spread of improvements as multiple farmers experimented with variations, all illustrated a collaborative approach to innovation that differed fundamentally from top-down agricultural development directed by experts and institutions. Farmers trusted what they could see working on neighboring farms more than they trusted theoretical recommendations from distant authorities, and they adapted general principles to their specific situations based on intimate knowledge of their own land, buildings, water supply, and livestock. The heatwave summer of 1946 became one of those reference points that farming families would mention for years afterward, a shared experience that connected people who had survived it and that defined a particular moment in agricultural history. Harold's grandchildren would grow up hearing stories about the summer so hot that cows stopped giving milk, and farmers had to hang wet cloth in their barns to keep animals alive. The stories carried practical information about heat management and water conservation, but also conveyed something less tangible about resilience and adaptation, about facing serious problems without the resources for expensive solutions, and finding ways to survive through ingenuity and shared knowledge. Those lessons remained relevant even as farming changed dramatically through subsequent decades, because agriculture always involved dealing with weather and natural forces beyond human control, and finding ways to protect crops and livestock despite uncertain conditions. On hot summer afternoons now, if you drive through rural areas of the Midwest, where family farms still operate, you might occasionally see variations of cloth cooling systems being used during heat waves. Some farmers have revived the technique as energy costs have risen, and sustainability concerns have made low-input technologies attractive again. Modern materials like synthetic outdoor fabrics can outperform the canvas and wool that mid-century farmers used, and solar-powered pumps can automate water distribution systems that once required manual monitoring. But the fundamental principle remains unchanged from what Emil Kruger described to Harold Dietrich in 1946. Evaporating water removes heat from air, and wet, porous material positioned in moving air creates effective cooling without electricity or expensive equipment. That simple physics worked for American farmers 70 years ago, and it still works today for those who understand the principle and know how to apply it properly. Thank you for watching this story about how American farmers protected their livestock during heat waves using cloth swamp coolers. If you appreciate learning about traditional farming techniques and the practical wisdom that sustained rural communities, please subscribe to our channel for more content about agricultural history and heritage. Hit that like button and share this video with anyone interested in how people solved real problems with limited resources and shared knowledge. This video is inspired by true events and actual practices used on American farms during the mid-20th century, and it is not intended to represent or offend any specific person or group. Harold Dietrich is a representative character who reflects the real experiences of hundreds of American farmers who faced similar heatwave situations and developed cloth cooling systems to protect their livestock during the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s across the Midwest and other agricultural regions.